It's no surprise that the Sega Genesis is one of my favorite consoles of all time. A lot of my favorite games came from this system. But even though I love this system, there are some games that I found that weren't great or just beyond disappointing. However, though, some Genesis games that were ported to the Game Gear ended up being better than its Genesis counterpart, and that's what I'm here for. I'm going to show you 5 Sega Game Gear games that were better than the Sega Genesis versions. Let's get right into it. It's going to be blunt. Batman Returns on the Genesis is terrible. The game looks so grainy, the music is really mediocre, and the gameplay is so stiff. Trying to use the hook shot in this game is just terrible. It's almost as bad as Batman Forever with its hook shot. It's also really easy to die in this game and just very hard to play. I remember thinking that this version was similar to the Super Nintendo version, but boy was I wrong. The Game Gear version is leaps and bounds better than the Genesis version in almost every way. The music was done by Motohiro Kawashima and it's amazing. The graphics are much more colorful than the Genesis version, and the gameplay and controls are much tighter. Instead of using your fists, it's like Shinobi where you're using your weapons. This is one Batman game I highly recommend, and the best part of all is that you could select different paths so it adds replay value to the game. Overall, this is a really solid game. I'm going to get some heat for this, but I think Jurassic Park on the Genesis hasn't really aged all that well. The Raptor can be fun still to this day, but the controls are much stiffer for both characters, and it's just not really fun to play it nowadays. The Game Gear version is much different, and honestly, it's for the better. You can pick any stage you want, and it starts with a car mini game where you get extra lives and health. And the gameplay is much more easier than its Genesis counterpart. It's way easier. The music is well done, and the graphics are really well. The controls are much tighter than the Genesis version, and it's overall a very enjoyable experience for the Game Gear. One that I think that's way better than the Genesis version. Next, we have Power Rangers on the Genesis. I'm not going to spend too much time on this game because I already talked about it on Power Rangers Month back in 2021, and my opinion still hasn't changed. It's just a mediocre fighting game with really bad controls, and the music is pretty iffy as well, and it's just not a very good game. For the Game Gear version, it's much better. For one, the controls are much more fluid and responsive, and it's basically a beat-em-up and a fighter at the same time. The music is pretty good, not all that great, but still nice to hear. But that's all I have to say because, as I mentioned, I already talked about this game a million times in the channel, so we're just going to move on to the next game. Shogun the Forever Man on the Genesis is a well-known title, for all the wrong reasons, mainly because of how brutally hard the game is. Many people just couldn't get far into this game, and it's weird that this game doesn't run at 60 frames per second, which is why I found it baffling that the Game Gear version runs a lot smoother. Go figure. This version is a lot better, mainly because the levels aren't as long and much more simpler than its Genesis counterpart, and the controls are much tighter. This is still a really hard game, but it's nowhere near as tough as the Genesis version. If you had a hard time with the Genesis version, check out the Game Gear version because I feel like it's way better. Last but not least, we have the Addams Family on the Genesis. This was made by Ocean, and it could have been a good game if it wasn't for the fact that I keep dying every 10 seconds. You only have 2 health, and if you get hit twice, you die. It just adds a lot of unnecessary frustration to the game. At least for the Game Gear version, it's much easier because, get this, you can withstand 2 hits. It's not really all that great, but it's a serviceable platformer for the Game Gear. It's also not as long as the Genesis version, so if you didn't like the Genesis version and found that game really hard, then check this one out. It isn't bad at all. And that, my friends, is 5 Sega Game Gear games that are better than its Genesis counterpart. Let me know in the comments what do you think, which Genesis game is better on the Game Gear. Let me know in the comments. Anyways, guys, thank you for watching. This Video Game Lover 58 signing out, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content.